When you're dealing with linear equations in two variables, when you start talking about intercepts, it's a nice time to also talk about horizontal and vertical lines, okay? The reason is we graph them using an intercept, okay? So let's do a quick recall. We know that a linear equation in two variables is any equation of the form ax plus by equals c, where a, b, and c are real numbers. That means a, b, and c could be positive, negative, fractions, decimals, integers, zero, any of those numbers. The only condition we have is that a and b are not both zero at the same time. Okay? So if a is zero, that's okay, but b can't be. If b is zero, that's okay, but a can't be. So what we're going to talk about now is what happens when a or b is zero. Okay? So let's go to another kind of like sheet of paper because I need to show you some stuff and I'll need a little bit of space. And then we'll come back here and we'll review. Okay, so we know that standard form of an equation is ax plus by equals c. So what if b equals 0? So a lot of this is in the notes on the original worksheet. I just need to show you some stuff. So you can still write on the regular worksheet. So if b equals 0, we would get ax plus 0y equals c. Well, 0 times y is just 0, and ax plus 0 is just ax. So ultimately, we would get ax equals c. A couple of things to notice. There's no y anymore. So when we look at the equation, that y kind of zeroed out. It had a factor of 0, it sort of disappeared. All right, and please understand it didn't just poof disappear. We're using the terms disappeared very loosely. We're just saying the y got multiplied by 0. And it left us with ax equals c. So without a y, we can't touch the y-axis. But I do have an x, so I have to touch the x-axis. So if we think about this kind of with the Cartesian plane, I've got my Cartesian plane here. I've got my x-axis. I've got my y-axis. I'm telling you, without a y, we can't cross the y-axis. With an x, we have to cross the x-axis. So what does that mean for us? We have to somehow cross the x-axis, but never cross the y-axis. And two lines never intersect, which is what we want to happen. We never want to intersect the y-axis. For that to happen, we have to be parallel to it. So two lines never intersect if they're parallel. So we must be parallel to the y-axis. Now, what kind of line is parallel to the y-axis? Vertical lines, okay? So that means that we are vertical. Thus, we are vertical. So all you would do is notice there's no y, there's definitely an x. That means that we can't touch the y-axis, we have to touch the x-axis. The only way to do that in the Cartesian plane is to be parallel to the y-axis, which makes us vertical. Okay, so that's great. We know we're a vertical line. Where do we cross the x-axis? So solve this for x to determine the x-intercept. You'll essentially get something where you get x equals a, where a is a real number, and more importantly, the x-intercept. So again, if b equals 0 in this standard form, so the coefficient of y is 0, that 0 times y just becomes 0. Okay, we're left with ax equals c, so some coefficient times x equals some constant. We know that means we can't touch the y-axis, we have to touch the x-axis, which means we have to be parallel to the y-axis, which makes us vertical. The issue is, where do we cross the x-axis? Solve ax equals c for x, and that tells you the x-intercept, okay? Now, let's think about what happens if a equals 0. So again, what if a equals 0? Well, I would get 0x plus by equals c. Well, 0 times x is just 0. 0 plus by is just by. So I get by equals c. So some things we need to notice here. Notice no x means I cannot cross the x-axis. Y means I have to cross the y-axis, have to at least touch the x or the y-axis, have to cross the y-axis. This can only happen if I'm parallel to the x-axis. This happens if I am parallel to the x-axis. Now, imagine the Cartesian plane again. We have the y-axis, whoops, we have the y-axis, we have the x-axis. I have to be parallel to the x-axis, which means I have to be horizontal, okay? So this means I have to be horizontal. All right. So that's all well and good. We know that if the A coefficient is 0, the x term just becomes 0. We're left with by equals c. We have a y, which means we have to cross the y-axis. We do not have an x, which means we cannot cross the x-axis. Two lines never intersect if they're parallel. So we want to be parallel to the x-axis so as not to cross it. This means we have to be horizontal, okay? Which is all well and good. But where do I cross the y-axis? Solve for y. So if you can solve this for y, you're going to get some coefficient y equals some constant. Solve that for y and you'll get y equals b, where b is a real number, so it'll be a fraction, a decimal, positive, negative, whatever. And not only is it a real number, it is very specifically the y-intercept. So if you have an equation that does not contain an x, solve for y, and that gives you the y-intercept. So when A is 0, something happens. When B is 0, something happens. And it's up to you to kind of remember what happens when. So if A is 0, the x term becomes 0, leaving you just a y. Just a y means you cross the y-axis, you do not cross the x-axis, which means you're parallel to the x-axis, which means you're a horizontal line. Solve for y to get the y-intercept. If B is 0, the B factor on y is 0, so the y term becomes 0, leaving ax equals c. With no y, you can't touch the y-axis. With an x, you have to touch the x-axis. The only way to do that is to be parallel to the y-axis, which makes us a vertical line. To figure out the x-intercept, you just solve for x, okay? So that's kind of the heart and soul of what I'm about to show you on your actual notes packet. So let's go to the notes packet, which is right here. Okay, so again, we have a linear equation is any equation of the form ax plus by is c. A, b, and c are real numbers. The only condition is a and b cannot both be 0 at the same time. If b is 0, the y term disappears. And again, we're using the word disappears real loose here. We're like, it disappears. It just becomes 0, okay? Leaving an equation with only an x. Without a y, the equation cannot touch the y-axis, which means the line must be parallel to the y-axis, making the line vertical. All right, vertical lines are always of the form x equals a, where a is the x-intercept. So when you realize you don't have a y, you know you're vertical, but you want to know where you cross the x-axis at, just solve for x. Now, if a is 0, the x term again disappears, okay, leaving an equation with only a y. And I think I have a typo there. It should say ay, not an y, but forgive me. Without an x, the equation cannot touch the x-axis, which means the line must be parallel to the x-axis, making the line horizontal. And it's all well and good to understand your horizontal, but you need to know where on the y-axis you cross. In order to do that, solve for y. You will get y equals b, where b is the y-intercept. So this is important. And this is important. So just know that when you solve for whatever variable you have, you're finding an intercept. All right, so let's look at example 4. So example 4 says graph each equation, state the intercepts. If one does not exist, say so. So for part A, I have 4x minus 5 equals -3. I'm just moving it over here so I have room to work things out. I only have an x. I don't have a y. That means I can't touch the y-axis. I have to touch the x-axis. That makes this vertical. Okay, but let's figure out where we cross the x-axis. So we're going to solve for x. I need to get my 4x alone. -5 is an issue, so I want to add 5. Well, -5 plus 5 is just 0. 4x plus 0 is 4x. So 4x equals, well, -3 plus 5 is 2. I want to divide both sides by 4. That'll undo the multiplication of 4 and x. 4 divided by 4 on the left is just 1. 1 times x is x. And then 2 divided by 4 is 1/2. That tells me my x-intercept is 1/2 comma 0. Now, so far, we haven't graphed a fraction. It's no big deal. You just kind of eyeball it. So we know this is going to be somewhere between 0 and 1. In fact, it's going to be halfway between 0 and 1 on the x-axis. So it's going to be in between these two right here. So I want to go halfway between those two spots. So I'm going to be right about here. And then I just draw my vertical line. Now, if you needed to answer the question, what's the y-intercept? Because the example does say state the intercepts. In this case, we don't touch the y-axis. So we would say the y-intercept does not exist. Just D and E does not exist. Now, also, if you're just itching to have a table of values, we know that x has to be 1/2 no matter what. Doesn't matter what we choose for y, x has to be 1/2. So we could choose -5, 0, 2. Doesn't matter. Your x is still 1/2. So if you were in a situation where you had to create a table of values, that's what your table of values would look like. Choose any y and x equals 1/2. Okay? Now let's look at part B. So part B, we have -3y plus 4 equals 1. I'm going to bring that over here to the right-hand side again. Now notice here, I don't have an x, but I do have a y. That means I have to cross the y-axis, cannot touch the x-axis, so I have to be parallel to it. So this means we're horizontal. Okay? But let's figure out where we cross the y-axis. So I want to solve this equation for y. My first issue is to deal with a 4. I need to isolate that -3y. So I subtract 4. 4 minus 4 is 0. 3 or -3y plus 0 is -3y. And then 1 minus 4 is -3. So I, at the moment, have -3y equals -3. I need to undo the multiplication of -3 and y, so I divide both sides by -3. -3 divided by -3 is 1. We say the 3's cancel. So we get 1 times y is y, and then -3 times -3 is 1. So if I were asked what are the intercepts, I would say, well, my x-intercept is 0, 1. Okay? Now, if I asked, okay, what's the x-intercept? Well, I have to be horizontal. I have to go through the y-axis at 1. So I'm going to have something that looks like this. So I'm not actually going to cross the x-axis, so it means I don't have an x-intercept. So I would say the x-intercept does not exist. Now, just like before, let's say you were really pushed to create a table of values. Well, we know no matter what, and you can see this graphically, no matter what value we choose for x, y is going to be 1. So let's say we choose -4, 1, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we chose -4, 1, and 6 for x. Well, regardless of which point we chose, y is the same. Y is just 1. So that's what a table of values would look like if you had to create one. Just really understand what it means to be horizontal and vertical, and as far as horizontal and vertical goes, which axis do you have to touch? Which axis can you not touch? Does that make you horizontal? Does it make you vertical? What is your intercept? Okay, so make sure you understand the difference between horizontal and vertical and how to graph those lines.